All right, hey guys. Wanted to go ahead and build on a principle that we had established the other day. One of the things that we were talking about is we're talking about BJJ practitioners in general and three different areas that they can use to progress in a more even balance. We had used sort of a linear progression chart in order to illustrate that, looking at your physical fitness level, looking at maybe takedowns, looking at your technique, things like that. Just looking at those areas, and we had just used three, but you can add in based on whatever it is that you're doing. You can add in more or less, or however you're going to do it. Using that same methodology, we're going to look at today how to do a threat assessment on yourself. Now, you can take a threat assessment too far. For example, the likelihood of me being gang raped by 1,500 Filipino gay ninjas is probably not real likely in my area here. That's not a particular problem that we have. So planning to mitigate that kind of threat would be throwing resources at something that is not likely to happen. So there's ways that you can actually weigh this out, one of which is called a Carver matrix, or an analysis of competing hypotheses. There's different analytical ways to go ahead and do this, but really it doesn't have to be that complicated. The fact of the matter is as everyday civilians, when you go out into the world, you want to be realistic about the kinds of threats and not overstate your own abilities, but you need to be honest about the types of threats that are out there and the likelihood of those threats coming into contact with you. So in doing a threat assessment of yourself, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to look at each one of these areas, and we're going to look at how to go ahead and mitigate those threats. So the first thing that we have up here is we got awareness. Awareness is absolutely key. In the absence of training, your body will default to a panic mode, and in that particular fight or flight state, everybody is going to react differently, and everybody's going to react differently based on different situations. There's no way to predict how you're going to act in a high-stress environment where a weapon's involved if you've never done any sort of training in that type of environment. So that's one of the reasons that we push really hard on force on force. Everything is theory until you validate it in force on force. And by force on force, I mean we're looking to remove as many of the restraints as we can while still maintaining a safe environment and still maintaining the learning principle. So awareness is absolutely key. And it doesn't have to be some extreme prepper into the world type of mentality, although you can go that far if you like. It could be just a matter of walking into a restaurant with your wife and a fire breaks out. Being aware of where the exits are when you walk into a theater. Being aware of where the exits are when you walk into a restaurant. There could be an active shooter, or it could be a situation where a fire breaks out. How are you going to get out there? What I'm looking to do is I'm looking to just walk in, I catch the exits, I see them, and I go ahead and I just start mentally processing. Well, if I sit over here, I'm going that way towards that exit, or I'm going that way towards that exit. And I start just mentally gaming how that's going to happen. It'd take you 2 to 3 seconds for you to just go ahead and process these thoughts, and those thoughts then begin to constitute training. It's not really so much a matter in those circumstances of you having to actually walk the route, although by all means, if you're at your work and you want to go ahead and walk an exfil route, by all means, go ahead. But it's a matter of you at least being able to build neural pathways. This is the direction that I'm going to go if something is going to happen. That way your brain has something to default to in the event of something catching you off guard. So awareness is key. Being aware of the people that are coming in, being aware of where the exits are, being aware of how you're going to respond. You're constantly taking in information and processing. The first thing, absolutely, under any circumstances whatsoever, is awareness. You need to be aware of the threats and where to go. The second thing we'll go ahead and look at is just look at like an individual threat. Walk out of the restaurant, I'm in a parking lot, and I got intoxicated guy who thinks my wife's hot, comes over and starts being belligerent. How am I going to deal with that type of situation? Well, BJJ works really, really well in one-on-one type encounters. I can take the individual down, I can control him, I can control his hands. Things like this, I can go ahead and put him unconscious, whatever the situation calls for, but BJJ is a good go-to in those types of scenarios. So that's how we're going to mitigate maybe that threat. We also have the risk of having multiple threats, so maybe 2 guys, 3 guys. I mean, if we start getting up 4 and 5 guys and stuff like that, we're getting into other things, things like weapons play and so on and so forth. But maybe I'm dealing with more than 1 guy, 2 guys coming out. Maybe one's intoxicated. Maybe they're both intoxicated. Maybe neither one of them is intoxicated. Regardless of the situation, this is probably not a scenario where I'm going to take the guy down and end up grappling him on the ground. So maybe I need to have some striking skills involved in order to be able to maintain control of the situation, but still be able to keep myself mobile to be able to defend myself, defend my wife, whatever the situation may be. So striking is an important element in mitigating that particular threat. Takedowns. BJJ is great, but you know what they say, 95% of the fights end on the ground, but it's like 99.9% of them start standing up, unless you're fighting with your spouse, in which case you probably said something and she smacked you. But you got to be able to take down. Now, judo, wrestling, whatever it is going to be your go-to as far as takedowns, you need to have some sort of a takedown. You need to have some sort of a plan to be able to take down, to be able to either take down and go down with him, or be able to take him down while you maintain a standing position so that you can deal with another attacker. So once again, we have a single attacker scenario, we have an environment scenario, we have multiple attackers. Next thing that we have is, look, you can fight all you want, you can have all the awesome ninja skills that you like. The fact of the matter is if you don't have the fitness to be able to maintain that fight for any duration of time, it's not going to matter. So fitness is a particular vulnerability. We need to make sure that we have good fitness in order to be able to mitigate those threats. In my particular area where I'm at, gun encounters are as likely as knife encounters, but by and large, most people are probably going to be faced with a knife encounter before they're faced with a gun encounter. That is by no means to say that knives are any less lethal than guns. I would say in a combative scenario where you're engaged in close combat, I would venture to say that knives are more lethal than guns. All you have to do is look at a couple of YouTube videos and you can see the aftermath of police officers engaging in knife combat and the damage that's done with a knife. So play that out how you will. A knife is a potential issue that you might have to deal with. That's a likely scenario. It may not be the highest in priority, but it is in there. Next thing would be a gun. Getting mugged. Batman scenario. Come out of a theater and here it is, the pre-incarnate Joker is facing you and your wife and your kid, and you have a gun to deal with. Knowing how to deal with that. Do you have a gun on you? Can you utilize that gun? So having skills with a gun, either to defend yourself against one or to employ one in an offensive role, that's a valid skill that you need to have. That's a valid tool that you can use to mitigate a threat. Going back to the situation with multiple attackers, if I have 4 and 5 guys, chances are striking is not going to be sufficient. BJJ is certainly not going to be sufficient. Awareness is awesome for me to be able to count 4 and 5 guys, but I still have to deal with the threat. So even though I started with awareness, if I'm dealing with 4 or 5 guys, we're talking about a gun situation or possibly a knife situation where I'm going to have to employ some sort of tool in order to mitigate those threats. So the last thing that we have is stress. Look, you can practice all the techniques that you want in the world. I can practice drawing in front of a mirror all day long, and I would encourage you to do so, to get that down to where it's just fluid. It's a non-conscious thought. The fact of the matter is if you're not doing it under stress, if you're not doing it under force-on-force scenario, then it's all just theory. Everything is theory until you employ it in a force on force, and by force on force, what I'm talking about is removing the restraints. I'm talking about putting on the headgear and putting on the gloves and actually testing the theories out in full contact if possible. For gunplay, you can utilize sims. Guys who don't have the budget for sims, I'll be honest with you, when we're doing combative stuff, I prefer airsoft for gunplay, simply because even at muzzle contact distance, I'm going to leave a hell of a welt and maybe skin, but I'm not going to actually embed somebody with that round. Whereas when you're using sims, you absolutely will do some serious damage on somebody within 6 inches of releasing a sim on somebody. So when you're using force on force, my personal preference is we default to a gas-powered airsoft pistol. It's an excellent way of actually vetting some of the techniques that you're doing and saying, yeah, you know, this is way too complicated, it's just not working, or for you to actually be able to employ it and say, yep, that works, and for you to start to build confidence in it. So you start off with a blue gun, and then you gradually start working into a maybe an airsoft type pistol where you're actually going full contact, removing as much of those safety barriers as you can. So all of these things play in, but you have to have stress in your training. BJJ guys, you guys know this better than anybody. You get out there and you can practice technique all day long. But if you don't actually get on the mat and actually grapple at the end and start employing those tactics, it's all just theory. Once again, going back to that comprehension, apprehension, and then conditioned response. If it stays at that apprehension level, you'll never be able to do it. If it stays at the comprehension level, you'll never be able to do it. It's only when you can actually build it to a level where your level of understanding is that you can employ this under stress as a conditioned response. Now you're conditioned for being able to employ whatever that tactic is.